Welcome to It's Art, Let's Talk About It, a podcast sponsored by the Museum of Western Art in Kerrville, Texas. Located in the heart of the Texas Hill Country, the museum is dedicated to the preservation and promotion of the American West, especially through the art of the West. In this podcast series, we will visit with artists, art collectors, and gallery directors working in the Western art genre. We'll talk about the history and heritage of Western art, and we'll talk about why talking about Western art is so important. I'm Daryl Beecham, the Executive Director of the museum, and I'll be your host for It's Art, Let's Talk About It. The podcast is a member of the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. In this episode of It's Art, Let's Talk About It, we visit with artist James Muir from Sedona, Arizona. We visit with the award-winning sculptor about what he calls allegorical art and how his work is a story told in clay and bronze. And today on It's Art, Let's Talk About It, our guest for the podcast is James Muir, an old friend of mine in the art world. And James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we go back a long way. And I want to talk about that for just a second. I was at the Pierce Museum, a brand spanking new museum director, learning my skills. One of the first artists I got a chance to really work with was James Muir, and it scared me to death. I remember going out to your studio in Ruidoso, or the Foundry studio, where you were doing a piece for the Pierce Museums called The Letter from Home. And it was so fun to see it in clay and to look through. It was a one-off piece. But you bill yourself, and you've written a couple of books about it, and you're known worldwide for allegorical art. Talk about allegorical art. What in the world is allegorical art? What does it mean to you?
Allegorical art is a very ancient concept that got lost and confused along the way with, if I may, more of a commercialization of art. And what it really means is allegorical art is art that has an intention to it. And that intention is to speak in terms of symbolism, to tell stories. It's an ancient way of artistically telling stories that were teaching means, especially back when people couldn't read. They couldn't read about history. They couldn't read about, most especially, the spiritual side of life, which is the most critical side of life. And so by using art, figurative and even non-figurative, but using symbology even in figurative art, it allowed the illiterate masses to be able to learn about life. And that has gradually, from around the Renaissance era, almost all art actually was depicting hidden messages in it, the symbolism, the language of symbolism. And I have always been attracted to the spiritual, the metaphysical, actually, aspect of spiritual. And by using symbolism, symbolism is an international language. There are, I forget how many thousand different languages in the world and variations of languages. But by symbolism, you don't have to filter what the message is, what you're trying to say, the intention of what you're trying to say, through the artificial filter of a specific language. Because words mean different things in different languages. So as soon as you put something into words, you're automatically limiting the understanding of it. But if you have a symbol, then people interpret what that symbol means without having to go through that filter of a language and variations of what those words mean.
Did you always know that you were going to be an artist?
Oh, Len, no. No, I didn't get into art until I was 35 years old.
What direction were you taking up to that point?
Trying to find myself And by that, not so much myself, but what my divine purpose was for this life. And I always had, born with an artistic talent, but I never pursued it because at that time when I was growing up, the only form of art, two forms, one was commercial art,
Right.
and the other was fine art. So it boiled down to, do you use your art to make money, or do you use it to make no money, but express what you want to express? But don't count on making a living from doing it unless you're that rare genius like we've been blessed with throughout history that can do both. Although for the most
But in your
part, they don't.
in your 30s, what was the moment that was there a moment, a trigger or something that said, I think I'm gonna pursue art for a living?
I had moved to Sedona, Arizona with my horses, and there was a superb art gallery there, Hughesburg Gallery, Alan and Sheila Hughesburg. They're deceased now, bless their hearts. And I was attracted to this gallery because I just had an intuitive feeling, attraction to particularly sculpture. And they also had quite a collection of Western memorabilia. And specifically, I remember McClellan horse equipment stuff there. I've always been actively in pursuit of historical truth, on the adage, ultimately, that those that don't remember history are condemned to repeat it. And so for me, I saw too many instances, whether it be from Hollywood or in books or from the official, it's like the adage of the victors of history.
That's true.
And
the official reports of history, yeah.
Exactly.
Are written by the people who win, yeah.
And so if you're going to study history or be exposed to history, then you owe it to yourself and to the world to study and learn what was true in history. And it all boils down to truth, which is a central core to my work. And I saw the art there, but specifically the sculpture. And I just related to sculpture. And ultimately, I'd look at some of the very well-known, even to this day, famous sculptors, and those everywhere in between. And I started to see things, of course, like I say, I've been involved with horses and working with horses and breaking, I don't call breaking, but training horses. And so I was into the psychology of the horses as well as the humans as best I could. And I'd see instances where a horse, what it was depicted as doing, its mind wasn't there. It was out in a pasture or something, but it was supposed to be a bucking horse. And in all humility, I thought, that's not right. That's not right. I wouldn't do it that way. And then ultimately I started to think, I could do that more, not better artistically at all, because I'm in awe of great artists. And like you have here at the museum, just awesome talent on the walls and in the sculpture and everything. I could never ascribe to even approaching that level. But in my naivete, I guess, it was like, I could do that. That would put more heart and mind into what that horse was doing.
Do you remember your first sculpture?
My first sculpture was a little piece, ironically, I get a kick out of it. I called it Parting Shot. So to start a career with a parting shot, but I did that piece. I started at about 9 o'clock at night. And actually, real quick in between there, I was working cowboying at a ranch outside of Sedona, just trying to make a living. Even though I had the college degree and the background and everything else, I didn't want to do all that. I always wanted to be a cowboy, and I got the cowboy. I would never call myself a cowboy. Neither would any of the cowboys that worked with me. But I did legitimately cowboy. But in the course of that, I found out about a little tiny sculpture foundry there in Sedona.
So we were talking about Parting Shot, the very first piece that you sculpted. you had talked about how you didn't see the truth in the animal and thought, maybe I can do this better.
And that's what got me started with it. And then I was able to get a job working at a little foundry there. Ended up working there for only 5 months, but that was my introduction. It has always served me well for not only being able to sculpt, but to know every step of the process, to be able to sculpt that is foundry friendly all the way through. So I worked there, and about the second month or so, third month, and I thought, I'm going to have to see if I'm correct in my intuitive feeling that I can do this. And so about 9 o'clock at night, I had some clay at where I was staying at the time. And by 3 in the morning, I had this little bust, just the head and shoulders of what came to be parting shot. And I added an arm, and he's cocking a pistol, but he's cocking it, again, with my detailed focus, a certain way that the cavalry had to cock a cap and ball pistol at the time, which was the start of all my detail orientation in applying it to my history pieces. And I took it into Hughesburg's gallery when it was cast. It only cost me $100 a cast at the time because I was working there, an employee. I took it into Hughesburg's gallery and showed it to him, and he said, I have a client that I think would be interested in buying this. How much do you want for it? I said, it would cost me $100, so I'd sell it for $200. And he said, well, let me send a picture of it to this client. And Sheila, his wife, said, no, we're just going to buy it right now. So they bought it right then and there, my very first piece. And I came in a day or two later, and there's my little parting shot bust sitting on a pedestal, like right next to a Grant Speed, in amongst some of the top sculptors and artists. And that piece, I did 25 of them. They sold it out in 30 days.
What did it sell for? Do you remember?
Sold for $300.
So they made $100 off of it. You made $100 off of it. Everybody else.
Exactly. And so then I got inspired, and my second piece was supposed to be two bank robbers caught out in the street. One's on a horse and the other's on the ground. And I got stuck with it. It just wasn't working. And so that's when I took a little break and did that little breaker's break piece, because, like I said, I used to break horses too. And so Alan, he called me Jim, and he was Swedish, so he said, Jim, do what you don't know cowboys and bank robbers, cavalry, because I had given him all the history of the cavalry military artifacts he had. So I went back that night and I changed it over to two cavalrymen, and it became Rescue Under Fire.
And it works.
And it worked.
Yeah.
And he bought one himself, a client bought one, and again, within 30 days, there were only 15 of them in the edition. It sold out, the whole edition, in 30 days. And the last one that sold that afternoon. It was sold for double what it sold for. And so that was the start of my career. It was like instant career.
We talk to artists all the time who labor and toil for years and years before they ever sell anything, and here's almost an exact opposite story.
It is.
Of how
This was
you're so fortunate to
literally an overnight success.
It had been bottled up in you for all that time, and all of a sudden it released.
Well, and of course, I believe everything is I could go in detail after detail of how a guiding hand guided everything I've done in life, from West Point to what I'm doing now. That guiding hand guides everyone, but we have to surrender to it.
Right.
And we have to recognize it's there in order to surrender to it. And so for me, I look back on it and say, at 35 years old, I didn't have time to spend half a lifetime studying art and learning it, so I had to do it on-the-job training. I had to learn and study as I created the pieces. And that has worked for 43 years. And it started off with, even though I could have gone strictly Western art, cowboys and Indians and such, that was too limiting for me, if I may. Because initially, by the second year, I understood, it was pointed out to me, what I was doing was allegorical art filled with symbolism. I had a story to tell. And that story had to be without boundaries, without fences.
Right.
And while what I initially got known for was my Indian War cavalry military, right, and then that branched into some Civil War, same thing. Each time telling a story that could best be told through that genre. At that time, and still to this day, but especially at that time, my focus was on depicting courageousness. But there was that story, and that has expanded now to include a 33-foot Christ crucifix at the Chapel of the Holy Cross in Sedona.
Let's talk about your monumentals, because my first exposure to you was a life-size work that we did for the Pierce Museum called Letter from Home. And I thought at the time it was huge, but then
I did too.
In Sedona, Arizona, at the chapel, there's a 32-foot, 30-some-odd-foot Christ on the cross.
Yeah, 33 feet.
And you're also known for caduceus and several of the monumentals. Texas A&M has several.
Yes,
in their campus. And talk about that whole. It's what inspired you to do bigger than life.
Well, some stories, because there's always been a message. I'm here. I'm just an instrument. This is part of why I can't claim credit for my success or my talent. It's Rush Limbaugh used to say, with talent on loan from God. And that sounds hubris, but it's not. It's a statement of fact that in order to tell the story, to focus in my own particular spectrum of my experience and my art on the divine story about humanity and the relationship to the divine and to each other, there's no limits to God. And while initially, and I loved and still love the historical aspect and everything, but that focus on the historical allowed me to tell messages that could be addressed to all different kind of areas. I've addressed the legal area. Right. Everything is patriotic at the bottom line for doing American art. And so it's been liberating for me and for my collectors to not be limited in what I do, but I can depict an Apache Indian like Broken Arrows, but it's telling a story, or any of the big pieces they were too big of a story to do at a tabletop size. They needed the magnitude because it was a bold, strong story to tell. And art used to be, and this is the beauty that I see with Western art, and like you have here at the Museum of Western Art, that is so invigorating to me, because when you look at the superb art you've got here, for example, these artists are telling stories.
Right.
They're telling stories about the highest and best of human nature, of humankind, no matter if it's a simple story, pastoral piece or something, and cowboy resting there or with his girlfriend, or you can flip that over and make it an Indian with his girlfriend. Right. It's the human commonality. You don't have to specify in language with it. People pick up the positive side and say, oh, that's wonderful. Modern art has lost its intention. Its only intention, no, I don't want to get into that.
Let's talk real quickly about the piece that's in the current show, 40 Years of Western Art. It's a moment of Custer's, at Custer's Last Stand, the battle for Little Bighorn. And your collector, Pablo Brinkman, is just so excited, that when I said I was looking for a work by James, I called, of course, your wife Linda, which we'll talk about here in a moment, And, Pablo said, "Oh, no, you're going to borrow mine." He was so passionate about that. That piece speaks to him. It speaks to a lot of people. Everybody's standing around staring at it. It was one of those moments where you wanted to isolate a moment in time at a particular battle. You've got you guys shooting in all directions, and it's just a fabulous work.
And I've always felt and learned to recognize that good art, but especially good sculpture, because I don't even draw. To me, it's too limiting to try to put a 5-dimensional concept onto a 2-dimensional surface. But I'm in awe of painters that can do it. That piece, every detail about that is historically accurate, down to the buckles on the horse harness and so on and so forth, which is just an idiosyncrasy, you could say, of me, Chant, to have every little, down to the buttons on the coat, the styles, accurate. That piece is an epitome example of the historical aspect. Sculpture, I learned early on, it has to grab your attention in the profile. Before you see detail or anything from across the room, it should grab you and say, "Oh, I got to go look at that." All too often, I haven't seen any of it here, obviously, because here, the closer you get, the more you are enraptured by the art, because you've got such superb artists here. But all too often, I would see something that attracted me from across the room, but the closer I got, by the time I got to it, it just lost all my attention. They didn't render it to the same standard as the artistic design was. The June 25th, 1876, I did that my second year of sculpting.
No kidding.
In 1982.
Wow.
And it's a classic example of what I was telling about, how I'm telling a story. All the details, that's just icing on the cake that I got known for. I've had pieces that were used in a college-level history class to tell people, show the students exactly what it really was like.
That's
there.
one of the things you're known for, is that beautiful detail. Look at the detail on a work.
Right, but the detail...
I've had other artists look up and go, "Wow, that buckle's exactly right." And things I wouldn't notice necessarily because I'm looking at the
Right,
picture.
I've had some of the historical best historians look at my work and say, "Wow."
And that's because of your years of study and your...
I've just always been, since a kid, interested in history. But the key is, and one of the points that I've always wanted to have to, in my mind, kind of clarify is my art is not about the detail. The detail is icing on the cake.
Right.
It's the story. And that piece is a classic case of that grabs you. That literally grabs you from across the room. And by the time you're up there, you're spending the next 20 minutes just turning around, looking at all the little things, looking at the expressions on the face, looking at how if you look backwards from the muzzle of the guns, you're right into the guy's eyeball where he's aiming. But the story that is being depicted is courageousness.
Right.
Because and that's why so many of my early pieces were focused on military subjects, because we can relate to courage under that. And in the face of death, certain death, humanity either comes up coward or hero. And again, in keeping with always depicting the highest and best, this June 25th depicts the highest and best, because these two troopers, they're buddies, they call them bunkies because they bunk together type of thing. They are being attacked. They're in the retreat, Reno's retreat from the valley. They're surrounded by Indians. A lot of the guys were panic-stricken. They were just being pulled off their horses, clubbed over the head with the tomahawks and stuff. They were scared, spitless, and just trying to get out of there. These guys have said, "Hey, if we're going to die, we're going to go down bravely." And I always admired the ancient samurai, where whenever they could, they would fight back to back, each one protecting his fellow warrior's blind side. That's what these guys
These
are
two
doing.
guys are shooting in opposite directions.
They're shooting in the opposite direction, not just that's out of survival, but to protect and make sure his bunkie, his fellow soldier, survives too. That's courageousness.
How many works do you think you've done in your career?
Not as many as really outstanding artists do. I've done something like 154 or something like that. I figured out once that I sculpted 254 hands.
There you go.
But it's somewhere 150 or something.
Speaking of top hands, let's talk for a second for somebody who's been an important part of my life, getting to know you, and that is your wife, Linda. I never
Talking about the power behind the throne.
I never knew James Muir without knowing Linda Muir. In the 30-some-odd years we've known each other, and it's always been Linda and James and Linda. And I introduced you recently at our 40th anniversary banquet, and I can't just introduce James without saying, man, what a force Linda Muir is.
Oh, she's the driving force. All credit goes to God, first and foremost. But with that understanding, we came into this world individually to come together to create what I've been blessed with, being able to be the hands to create it. The guidance came from God, but the mechanics of all of this, hands down, is due to Linda. And it's that duality. It's the yin and the yang, the feminine and the masculine, the heart and the head. I've got, in spite of a degree in business, which, like I say, the only thing I remember from that is buy high, sell low. But I am, and that's why I didn't quite click with the military career that I started out with at West Point, because I'm heart. As artists generally come from the heart.
Right.
That's been changed to where they do the head to get the commercial side of it and all, but all too often it's at the expense of the heart. Artists owe it to ourselves and to the Creator to produce from the heart, because that's where God is. God's in the heart. God's not in the head. God's in the heart. And I have difficulty sometimes, increasingly, over the last 42 years, 43 years, relating to the world from a mental, mechanical level. That's where Linda is. She's both heart, but she's also incredibly sharp with the mind. And she keeps me on track.
You've been very blessed to have a career that you've had in the 40 years of Western art, the exhibition that you're currently in at the Museum of Western Art. One of the things we tried to select were people who've made an impact in that 40 years. And you look back over your career since that first parting shot. Do you feel like you've made an impact in the Western art world?
It's hard for me to identify that because I don't think about my own status and everything. I'm just a humble sculptor that's been blessed with a talent. But I've reckoned. Somebody asked me once in an interview, said, "What do you think your legacy is?" And I said, I never even thought of a legacy. I don't even know I had to figure out what it is, but I have come to recognize that, yes, my art has, after 43 years, it's a physical legacy that I'm leaving. Not about James Nathan Muir, the person, necessarily, other than every piece that I have done in all these years is a biographical, three-dimensional, ideally five-dimensional, rendering of what I went through in my life on my way back to God, is what I tell people. And my books are not autobiographical, except they are chronological in a way, especially the first one, because it shows my path, as I say, back to God. And if people can identify with that piece, then by knowing the story behind it, the symbolism behind it, maybe what they're really identifying with is themselves on their own journey back to God.
Do you have a favorite among all the works you've ever done?
Yes.
Care to explain which one that is?
No.
It's one of those trick questions artists. I ask that question, of a lot of artists.
I do have a favorite from a personal perspective, and that's a piece I did called Liberté.
Okay.
And it's certainly not Western art or anything. It's a patterned after the Statue of Liberty. She's looking up. Two of the rays are gone. The seventh one, which is a spiritual ray, it's rendered asunder. We don't know where that went to anymore. The sixth one, the six is the number of responsibility. It's behind her back like a dagger as a warning to tyranny. And she has a tear. She's looking heavenward and she has a tear. And the pedestal is just a head, but the pedestal is the broken tablet that the Statue of Liberty has of July 4th, 1776. And my wife and I, we got married on the 4th of July. That's how patriotic I am. But it's more than just patriotism to America. That's the icon of it. It's about human liberty. When I never knew it, but when I was in high school, I was in RTC, and I was awarded from the Sons of the American Revolution, which I've for years become a life member of it, and a little statue of liberty, and it was called the Human Liberty Award. And that piece, all these years later, came to identify what I was really about. It's about human liberty, human physical liberty, but above and beyond even human mental liberty, it's about human spiritual liberty. To know the truth and the truth shall set you free is a spiritual concept that needs to be applied to the world and everyday world that we live in. And so that, in essence, is a summation of what I'm about, is helping through my art to bring an awareness of and a pursuit of, and it takes courage, human liberty.
James, we appreciate your time today. It's art. Let's talk about it. And I know you were a little concerned that you might not be able to fill up an entire podcast, but...
No, I was concerned that I couldn't limit it.
So eloquently said. And we appreciate all the support you've given the Museum of Western Art and me personally over the years. And it's such an honor to have you in exhibitions here at the museum. Congratulations on what I think is a phenomenal career, and all the best for things to come.
Thank you, but let me in turn, if I may, blow my horn on your behest too, because the Museum of Western Art is tremendously honored by and a benefactor of your role here.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank
what you have done. And I also want to thank Pablo Brinkman for making this reconnection with you here, and to give us an opportunity to come back here and see what an incredible job you have done with this museum.
Thank you for saying so. And our guest today has been James Muir, allegorical artist and a great friend of the museum and myself personally. And James, thank you for joining us today on It's Art. Let's talk about it.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of It's Art. Let's talk about it. A production of the Museum of Western Art in Kerrville, Texas. We hope you'll visit the museum in person. We're located at Bandera Highway. Please find out more about us by going to www.museumofwesternart.com. And we hope you'll join us next time for It's Art. Let's talk about it. The podcast is produced by the Texas Hill Country Podcast